Hello, good evening and welcome, both to those of you here in the room tonight and also to those joining us from home as part of our live stream. I'm Caroline Howitt. I am the Programme Director here at Panmure House, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for a very special tercentenary lecture. This is, as many of you know, a very important year for us. Not just because it's the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith's birth, but this year also marks the beginning of the next phase of our project, with the arrival of our new Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism. Thanks to the extremely generous support of our donors, we're now able to realise a long-held ambition to have our own dedicated research team who are going to address the biggest economic and social questions of the day, just as Smith and his Enlightenment contemporaries did here. Serendipity has been at work. We've even managed to find someone called Adam to fill that position. Professor Adam Dixon is now responsible for developing and leading research here at Panmure House. He's focusing on the distinct but interrelated topics of sustainable finance, sustainable innovation, and sustainable leadership. He worked previously at the University of Bristol and then at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, where he held a large European Research Council project as one of the world's leading experts on sovereign wealth funds. Adam is trained as an economic geographer and a political economist, meaning he brings a truly holistic and interdisciplinary perspective to his work, just as Adam Smith did. So please now join me in welcoming to the Panmure House stage for the very first time your host for this evening, the inaugural Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism, Professor Adam Dixon.
Great, welcome everyone, those of you here in the room and those listening online. It's such a beautiful day here in Edinburgh. It's always sunny. I was just saying earlier that I don't think the weather is as bad as people think. I've been here since February and I find that the sun is frequently out. So I want to say a bit about the history of Panmure House and its restoration. This house was built first in 1691. Though as I recently learned last week that there was a home here in the medieval period. And there it was also, because during excavations there was a medieval oven that was found, and the archaeologists said that this meant that this place was, even in that period, a significant home. It was, though in 1691, the town seat of the Earl of Panmure, hence its name. Adam Smith, the most famous resident of this house, lived here between 1778 and 1790. While here he completed major revisions of his two great masterworks, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments. During these 12 years, the house was a hub of intellectual enlightenment and discussion about all the big issues of the day. Today, Edinburgh Business School and Heriot-Watt University, they've returned Panmure House to that purpose. The university and Edinburgh Business School rescued the house in 2008, and they spent a decade and £5.6 million restoring it to its 18th century standard, though with some modern additions. And now, once again, we're trying to make it, and we will make it, the home of economic and social debate. I should note that Panmure House is not a museum, nor is it a shrine to Smith. Rather, we see Panmure House and the legacy of Adam Smith as an invitation. It's an invitation to forge new thinking and new ideas on the pressing issues of our day. Indeed, the kinds of questions that Smith and his contemporaries were asking and reflecting on are in many ways no different to the kinds of questions that drive many contemporary debates, from the origins of morality to what makes a good political economy. What makes countries wealthy, prosperous, and just? How can we address poverty as an issue of material well-being, but also an issue of happiness and aesthetic enrichment? What is the role of the state in the economy, in education, in the provision of public goods? In short, what kind of society do we want to live in, and what do we owe each other? As such, Panmure House programs are designed to engage us with big issues that face us today, and to promote nuanced respectful debate at a time when it is much needed. Panmure House programs are designed to engage. Tonight we are delighted to continue one such program, and that is the Adam Smith Lecture Series. In this high-caliber lecture series, the world's best economic thinkers, practitioners, and Nobel laureates return to the birthplace of modern economics to deliver original keynote lectures of global relevance. We have the privilege of welcoming Baroness Minouche Shafik, who is a leading economist whose career has straddled public policy and academia. She was appointed director of the London School of Economics and Political Science in September 2017. She did her BA at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, her MSc at the LSE, and a DPhil at Oxford University. And by the age of 36, she became the youngest ever vice president at the World Bank. She taught at Georgetown University and the Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania and has published widely. She served as the permanent secretary of the Department for International Development here in the UK from 2008 to 2011. And she was deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund between 2011 and 2014, and was a deputy governor of the Bank of England from 2014 to 2017, where she sat on all monetary, financial, and prudential policy committees and was responsible for a balance sheet of over £500 billion. Baroness Shafik has sat on and chaired numerous boards and currently serves on the board of trustees of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the supervisory board of Siemens, the council of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the global board of BRAC, and is deputy chair of the board of trustees of the British Museum. She was made a Dame Commander of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2015, a crossbench peer in the House of Lords in 2020, and an honorary fellow of the British Academy in 2021. On July 1st, 2023, this year, she will serve as the 20th and incoming president of Columbia University in New York, and she will be the first woman since its founding in the year 1754 to hold that position. Baroness Shafik is here to talk about her book, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract. We could not be more delighted to welcome Baroness Shafik to Panmure House to discuss a topic so fundamental to its past and so critical to its future. Please welcome Baroness Minouche Shafik.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that very kind and generous introduction and warm welcome. It's really an honor to be here today to give this lecture, and a genuine pleasure to share this beautiful day in Edinburgh with all of you in this historic space. I wanted to particularly thank Professor Richard Williams for hosting me and Professor Dame Helen McGregor for extending the original invitation, and to all the staff here at Heriot-Watt University and Panmure House for their hospitality and for making this such a wonderful occasion. Now, of course, as an economist, a policymaker, and now president of the London School of Economics and Political Science, at least for a couple more months, it is really the culmination of a dream to be able to give a lecture in memory of Adam Smith in his only surviving residence and in the 300th anniversary of his birth. Smith, of course, was the founder of the discipline to which I've devoted my career, and so I feel a deep and abiding connection to any institution associated with him. I should also point out that as a graduate of Oxford and having an honorary doctorate from Glasgow University, I also share both of Smith's alma maters. So even beyond his towering contributions to the dismal science, Adam Smith's ideas have shaped my life and the lives of people across the planet. He was, of course, a key figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, and his evangelism for the power and necessity of reason, empirical evidence, and civic engagement in resolving conflict and advancing human flourishing really did change the world for the better. I've devoted the last 6 years of my career to preserving and championing that transformative legacy in the higher education sector in the UK, and I look forward to trying to do the same in my new role in the US. I think it's never been more important to defend that intellectual inheritance in the face of populism and tribalism. So along with it being an honor and a pleasure, it's also a challenge to have been invited to give this lecture, not only because of the eminent and distinguished people who have spoken before me, including my former colleague Andy Haldane, and of course the venerable Sir Angus Deaton, but it's also a challenge to speak at this particular time on this subject. With the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, and geopolitical tensions, it can sometimes feel a bit perverse to discuss anything but these immediate challenges and pressures. In moments like this, I draw inspiration from one of my esteemed predecessors as director of the LSE, Lord William Beveridge. His famous report, which provided the conceptual foundation for the British welfare state, was published in late 1942, as British soldiers were still engaged in a life or death struggle on the continent with no guarantee of success. Beveridge knew that as a society, we can never allow our urgent present to obscure our important future. He was famously good at making a complete nuisance of himself in Whitehall, making arguments for the creation of a national health service or widespread unemployment insurance, even as the bombs were dropping onto London. And we must learn from his example and recognize there'll never be a quiet moment to shape tomorrow, and accept that for better or worse, now is the only chance that we have. And of course, I also draw inspiration from the namesake of this lecture. Standing here in this place where Adam Smith completed the final edition of The Wealth of Nations, arguably the most famous and influential work in the history of the social sciences. And of course, one has to reckon with both its genius and the fact that it has been used for political purposes in many contexts. Indeed, the fame and influence of The Wealth of Nations, while not, of course, Smith's fault per se, is in some ways responsible for the caricature of Smith and modern economics as singularly obsessed with growth, competition, and the primacy of individual concerns, reducing some of his most important insights in intellectual history to a narrow justification of self-interest. And while it's not novel in an audience of what I'm going to guess are Smith devotees, I think it's always important to share the necessity of reading Smith's second book only in the context of his first. Of course, written 23 years before, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher long before he was an economist. And in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith qualifies his later insights into human beings' self-interested nature with a focus on sympathy. He writes about the importance of fellow feeling as the basis for our moral sentiments, what today we might call empathy. This is part of a long philosophical tradition from the early Stoic philosophers, Heracles, who developed a theory of how we belong to concentric circles, which he called eikeiosis, the innermost circle being the individual, surrounded then by the immediate family, the extended family, the local community, citizens, and ultimately all of humanity to whom we had a relationship. And of course, others like Aristotle, Aquinas, Rawls, and many others follow in that tradition. In Adam Smith, sympathy moderates our passions and enables us to live in harmony with others in a social order. Much of economic thinking has focused too much on Adam Smith's self-interest legacy and not enough on his sympathy legacy. And in my book, What We Owe Each Other, I try and balance these two aspects to show that an economy can only function when it operates in a spirit of inclusivity and reciprocity, and that is both good for efficiency and opportunity. So let me turn to what I think a more modern application of this approach would look like. And I can't help but, of course, bring us to some of our contemporary problems. If you look at the British economy today, it has two major problems. One is a cost of living crisis in a time that, a cost of living crisis which is fueled by dramatic shifts in the supply and demand for goods, particularly energy, in a time of war, plague, and other disruptions to trade. And the second problem, perhaps the more severe one, is an entrenched and toxic blend of structurally low growth and productivity, or what the Economy 2030 inquiry, which I'm participating in and is a joint product of the LSE and the Resolution Foundation, memorably calls stagnation nation. With the highest inflation rate in the G7, labor productivity at the bottom of the OECD, shrinking real wages since 2010, and a host of other terrible economic indicators, it's no surprise that the Bank of England projects that in this year and last year, British households will have seen the biggest collapse in living standards since such records were first kept 60 years ago. Now, you may think that I'm going to say that the problems of the UK stem from too much emphasis on self-interest and not enough on sympathy. But I think it's actually the failure to see the interaction between the two that is the problem. The economic problems in the UK and in many other countries reflect the breakdown of the basic set of norms, rules, benefits, and obligations that bind individuals, firms, states, and states together and lay out what we owe each other, what I call the social contract. Quite simply, over recent decades, we've seen a breakdown in the consensus about the way the economy functions and most people's expectations of what society will provide them and what we should ask of them. From the recent spike in energy prices to the NHS backlog, we're failing to provide a decent minimum level of security for the worst off. In our failure to put in the maximum investment in the capabilities of citizens, we're ensuring sluggish future growth and embedding greater inequality between people and places. And in our flexible but insecure labor markets and our haphazard approach to decarbonization, we're failing to share risks intelligently and equitably across society. So what I hope to accomplish tonight, and what I hope that I accomplished in my book, is to make an argument that our social contract is broken, but also suggest how we might organize ourselves differently to provide greater security and opportunity to our society. And such an approach will both increase well-being, but I think also provide a set of responses to not just our current challenges, but our long-term ones. So, what are these long-term questions that shape the social contract and that I think are no longer working? Well, let me give you some of the kinds of questions that we should consider. Are children raised at home by mothers or grandparents? Or does the state provide childcare centers or paid parental leave so that both parents can work and continue to raise their children? How much of health and social care is the responsibility of individuals, and how much of it should we pay for collectively through insurance or public funding? Do we expect employers to provide contracts with regular hours and benefits, such as sick leave and pensions, or do we expect workers and their families to carry those risks of illness and old age? And how much do we invest in future generations, and what endowment do we leave them in terms of physical, human, and natural capital? Let me start by saying why I think the current social contract is broken. So until the late 20th century, the social contract was built on the premise that families would have a primary male breadwinner and that women would take care of the young and the old. There was a presumption that people would stay married until they died and give birth to children only when married. They would have steady employment with very few employers over a career, and the education and skills that they accumulated at school would be sufficient for their lifetime. And most would have only a limited number of years of life after retirement, and the support that they needed in their old age would be provided by their families. Those assumptions still underlie many aspects of our current social contract, and yet they could not be more irrelevant. Today, half of the women in the world are employed in the labor market globally, and the upward trend is universal. In advanced economies, between a third and half of marriages end in divorce, and in most developing countries, the rates of divorce are lower but are increasing steadily. A growing proportion of children are born outside of marriage. The average worker has more jobs over the course of a lifetime, and technology is likely to only increase that over time. And while many developing countries are still transitioning to get more workers employed in the formal sector, there are growing signs of informality in labor markets in advanced economies as more and more people are employed in precarious work with few benefits. And of course, climate change brings massive risks that could disrupt our economies and the sustainability of our societies. I think the biggest disruptors to the social contract thus far have been the changing role of women, which have fundamentally affected how we think about childcare and elderly care, and technology, which is fundamentally changing work and education. And looking ahead, I think there will be even more disruptions as a result of aging and climate change. Of course, the pandemic revealed the cracks in our social contract even more, with women struggling with homeschooling, precarious workers unable to take sick leave when they had COVID, and those in the most vulnerable groups suffering the greatest loss of life. On the flip side, the pandemic also showed us that education can be done differently, and work as well, and we're only at the beginning of adjusting to those new possibilities. Now, before I move to some examples, I wanted to first start by making an important distinction between what I call the social contract and the welfare state, because they are not synonymous. The social contract reflects all the ways that we organize things to deliver collective goods through families, communities, employers, and the state. The welfare state is just one mechanism for delivering common goods. There's often a misconception that the welfare state is primarily about redistributing income from the rich to the poor, what my colleague at the LSE, Nick Barr, calls the Robin Hood function of the state. But the main purpose of the welfare state is actually to redistribute income over our own lives, what is sometimes called the piggy bank function of the state. That is about 3/4 of what the state does. So if I'm a clever child, I can't walk into a bank and ask them to finance my education. The welfare state finances that child's education and then expects that child to pay taxes when they're adults as a form of repayment that enables everyone in society to benefit from their education. In some ways, the current system of financing higher education in the UK embodies this concept. Students are lent money by society through the student loan scheme and are expected to pay it back when they have earned above a certain level. I'll just show you an example for the UK, which comes from my wonderful former colleague John Hills, who we lost a couple of years ago, which shows how much we put in and take out of the state in the UK at different stages in our lives. And what it shows you is that when you're young, people tend to be beneficiaries of the state because of spending on education and health. I'm going to show this here, education, which is here. And so when we're young, we're beneficiaries of, we're net recipients of money from the state because we benefit from education. In the middle of our lives, when you see that great big hump, we are net contributors to the state through the taxes that we pay. And then later in life, we again are net recipients from the state because of pension and adult social care spending and health spending. What John Hills shows in his book is that for the typical person in the UK, over the course of your life, you put into the state about as much as you take out. You might think that wealthy people pay more in tax, but wealthy people live longer. and they benefit from pensions and healthcare for longer than poor people. So on balance, people tend to put in about as much as they put out. And so this piggy bank function role of the welfare state is really the most important thing. It is at the heart of what economists call pre-distribution policies, policies that invest in and around citizens to enable them to be productive and to contribute to society throughout their lives. Now let me turn to why I think the current social contract is broken and what would be a better way to organize it. And I'll give you 3 examples, one from education, one from employment, and one from the intergenerational social contract. And I'll start with education. So we have made huge progress globally in getting more children into school, particularly in primary and secondary education. I spent a big part of my career when I worked in international development trying to get, as we used to say, bums on seats, getting kids into school because of the huge social benefits. And here's just an illustration of a bunch of countries which shows where spending happens. And in most countries, most of the spending is spent on primary, secondary, and tertiary education, roughly between the ages of 5 or 6 to early 20s. What the chart also shows is that spending on what's called pre-primary education, the black line at the black rectangle at the beginning, and adult learning, which is the very end of the bar charts, tends to be far smaller in most countries. But research from places as different as Jamaica and Chicago show that providing extra nutrition to preschool children and supporting parenting skills results in better education outcomes and higher incomes later in life. A well-known study in Jamaica in The Lancet, for example, showed that a weekly visit by a community health worker resulted in those children having 40% higher incomes as adults relative to a control group. In the UK, we used to have a program called Sure Start, but we never ran a randomized controlled trial nor sustained it long enough to be able to comprehensively evaluate its benefits. But longitudinal evidence from other countries, again in The Lancet, shows how acting in the first 1,000 days of life, when brain development is highly influenced by nutrition and mental stimulation, can generate benefit to cost ratios of roughly 17 to 1. And that builds the foundation for future learning. So I would argue that if you care about social mobility, the early years education is about the best investment that you can make. At the other end of the spectrum, the forces of technology and aging will mean that people will work for much longer and must change jobs more often. Hundreds of studies of adult learning have demonstrated that strong links to employers, early intervention, and sustained funding can increase employability of adults. In the UK, we have some of the best universities in the world, but we have failed about half the population that does not go to university through endless tinkering and chronic underfunding of further education. So I would argue a better social contract in the realm of education would invest more in the early years when the possibility of equalizing opportunity is the greatest, and more in adult education where longer careers and technological changes mean reskilling throughout life will be essential. Let me turn to another example, which is employment and how we could organize a better social contract in employment. One of the most striking things about modern labor markets is that informality, which we used to associate with poor countries, has become a feature everywhere. I often joke that the gig economy is just a cool name for the informal sector. More workers are on flexible contracts as our labor force has become more diverse and technology has made that possible for firms to outsource ever more activities. And this flexibility has had huge benefits for employers as well as consumers who have seen falls in the costs of many goods and services, ranging from low-cost airlines to taxis and transportation to consumer goods. For those employed on flexible contracts, they may now have jobs that they might not otherwise have had. But it comes with a great deal of insecurity about their incomes, hours of work, and what happens when they're sick or old. I think a better social contract would retain those benefits of flexibility while providing workers with more security in the form of mandatory benefits for all workers, generous unemployment insurance, and opportunities for retraining throughout life. I'll show you a chart here. It's a little bit small, but I'll talk you through it. This shows how countries have made very different choices between flexibility and security. The bottom axis is flexibility. As you move to the right, the labor market is ever more flexible. The y-axis is employment protection. So as you move up, workers have more protections. Now, most advanced economies are in the upper left-hand quadrant, where you have low flexibility and high levels of employment protection. So countries like France and Germany and the Netherlands are in that quadrant. Many developing countries have dual labor markets, where you have high protection and low flexibility for those few workers in the formal sector. So that's why the lower left-hand quadrant, you see lots of developing countries, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, the Philippines, etc., where you have low flexibility and low protection. The sweet spot is countries like Denmark and New Zealand, which is the upper right-hand quadrant. There you have employers have a high degree of flexibility, being able to hire and fire as the market changes, but workers also get high levels of protection. In those economies, the social contract protects the worker, not the job. In fact, in many Nordic countries, you have the highest rate of labor turnover of anywhere in Europe. And workers don't even get severance pay or notice periods. High degree of flexibility. But they get very generous unemployment insurance, which maintains their previous level of income or close to their previous level of income, and retraining, and they tend to be very quickly reemployed. So I think a better social contract would adopt this flexicurity approach and combine it with mandating benefits for all workers regardless of their employment contract, including for self-employed workers. Just as we now have got used to the idea of workers having, many of us having portable pension pots, that as we move from one employer to another, we take our pension with us, I think we should move to a world where workers have portable benefit pots. And those benefit pots would involve contributions from all their employers to pay for holiday pay, health insurance, training allowances, and sick leave, and parental leave as well. Over time, we could imagine that benefit pots for all workers would be funded in such a manner. So that's my example from employment. Let me turn then finally to the intergenerational social contract. In every society, every generation wants to leave the next one better off. And yet I think we are at risk of leaving the next generation worse off, with poorer prospects for their livelihoods, a legacy of very high debts, and a severely damaged planet. In most advanced economies, parents fear that, in many advanced economies today, parents actually think their children will be worse off than them. Here's the result of some polling where people are asked, to what extent do you feel that today's youth will have a better or worse life than their parents, or will it be about the same? And what's incredibly striking about that is that the advanced economies, which are at the bottom, most people think their children will have a worse life. Whereas in the developing world, at the top, China, Peru, India, Indonesia, most parents still believe that their children will have a better life than them. And it shows the very different expectations in those parts of the world. Of course, the pandemic has also disrupted the education of millions of children around the world and resulted in the accumulation of debts never before seen in human history. But I think you would also agree that there is no doubt that the earth our children will inherit, whether they're in rich or poor countries, will have less biodiversity, will be hotter, and will carry more environmental risks for them. So how can we put this intergenerational social contract right? I think we need to invest hugely in the education of young people to enable them to be productive over what will be very long working lives. The resulting gains in productivity will help pay for the elderly care needs of an aging population and also generate some economic growth, which will make those debts they're going to inherit more sustainable. I think we should also give younger people an educational endowment for life so that they can adapt to changes in work. And everyone should have access to better reskilling opportunities so that they can contribute to society for longer. We must do much more to redress environmental damage and find ways to help reduce the fiscal burden on future generations. To achieve that, today's older people will need to work longer. And that is, I know, a very controversial issue and a timely issue which we can discuss later. To achieve that, I would link eligibility for pension to life expectancy in a mechanical way. And so that as people live longer, they will automatically expect to have to work a little bit longer. And I think that would be an enlightened investment by one generation in the next and provide the basis for a new social contract between the generations. Let me now try and pull together what I think are the three principles that should guide us in thinking about what a better social contract would look like. And they are minimum security for all, maximum investment in opportunity and capability, and better risk sharing. Let me just describe what I mean by each of those. Minimum security for all. In every society, I think it's possible to put a floor on people's incomes below which no one should go. I am not a proponent of universal basic income. We can discuss that too, because I think it fundamentally violates the notion in the social contract that everyone who can contribute should, in exchange for being looked after when they can't contribute. But you can achieve a minimum security for all through cash transfer programs in developing countries, many of which I've worked on over the years, or tax credits for low-wage workers in advanced economies. That minimum, of course, should include access to basic health care and a minimum state pension in old age to avoid destitution among the elderly. It should also include sick leave and unemployment insurance, regardless of the type of employment contract. In developing countries, that means bringing more people into the formal sector. In advanced economies, it means mandated that employers contribute to benefit pots for all workers. What about maximum investment in opportunity and capability, my second principle? So I think in too many places, talent is wasted because opportunities are not provided to all. And disaffection is often greatest in those countries where prospects for improving your lot are the worst. This chart shows a very simple figure, which is how many generations does it take to go from the bottom of the income distribution in a country to the middle? And in the UK, it takes 5 generations to go from the 10th decile, the lowest decile in the income distribution, to the middle. Same in the US, 5 generations. In Denmark, it takes just 2. In South Africa or Brazil, it takes 9 generations. That means that as a parent, you have no prospect of ever seeing any descendant of yours ever become middle class if you're born poor. Now, much of this talent that has no chance to rise is embedded in women, in minority groups, in children who happen to be born into families or in places that are unable to give them opportunities. If you look at the US economy between 1960 and 2010, over a 50-year period, better use of all the talent has contributed between 20 and 40% of the productivity gains in the US economy. Why? Because instead of just drawing on a narrow talent pool of white men, employers could employ women or black people, and as a result could put people in the jobs that suited them best, and that resulted in massive gains in productivity. Similarly, if today's lost Einsteins, women, minorities, children from low-income families, were enabled to invent to the same degree as men from high-income families, and this draws on a wonderful piece of research done by Raj Shetty at Harvard and John Van Reenen at LSE, they show that if you could get those lost Einsteins to produce at the same levels as those who have opportunities, the rate of patenting, the rate of innovation in the economy would quadruple. So, how could we better use the talent in our societies? In addition to investing in the early years, where intervention is very powerful, we could give all young people an endowment to invest in their education for life, as I mentioned earlier. And while most countries have equalized education opportunities for girls and boys and closed the gender gap in education, in fact, globally today there are more women who go to university than men everywhere. But women still have huge disadvantages in the workplace because they do, on average, about 2 hours more of unpaid work every day in terms of housework and childcare. So more generous parental leave, public funding to support families, and a fairer division of labor at home would mean that we would better use all the female talent in our societies. I should mention that in the UK, the government's proposed lifelong learning entitlement is a good example of movement in this direction. The idea of allowing all citizens to gain skills over the course of their lives will encourage people to invest more in their future skills and prosperity. Of course, one of the reasons this program is needed is because we've seen a massive collapse in workplace training, particularly after COVID, and more so over the last decade, as employers and employees are less connected to each other. And so that means that having another way for people to be able to reskill themselves is even more important. Now let me turn to my third principle, which is sharing risks better. Too many risks in our societies are being borne by individuals when they could be more efficiently borne by others or managed collectively. And we've seen a huge shift in recent decades of more and more risks being put onto individuals. The move from, for example, defined benefit pension schemes to defined contribution schemes is a good example of that. When you think about the fact that 90% of the population doesn't know the difference between a stock and a bond, the rationality of asking people to manage their pensions individually is not obvious. Anyway, but it is possible to maintain flexibility for employers in being able to hire and fire workers depending on market conditions if those workers know that they will receive unemployment insurance and retraining, and that will provide them with security to find a job. And so managing that risk of economic shocks could be done much better in a different way. A similar rebalancing of risks and where they're born needs to occur around childcare, around health, around old age. It's never been clear to me, for example, why the cost of maternity leave is usually borne by employers, when parental leave paid through, for example, general taxation would create a more level playing field in the labor market for men and women and would reduce the burden on firms, particularly small ones. Similarly, many health risks are much more efficiently managed by pooling them across a large population and providing very strong incentives for individuals to manage the risks around things like diet and exercise, which we know are going to be the key drivers of long-term life expectancy gains. Automatic enrollment in pension schemes is clearly a good example, and insurance for old age care, which gives individuals more security at the end of their lives. Countries like Japan and Germany, for example, require people to buy social care insurance once they reach a certain age as a way to pool the risks around old age and not knowing what care needs people will have. So let me just say a couple of words about, is all this affordable? Because that's the obvious question to ask. In the book, I provide some examples of the fiscal consequences of a better social contract. Increasing publicly supported childcare, early years education, and lifelong learning would require more spending. But some of the spending would be investment, and that will generate higher future tax returns. In the UK, for example, the returns to tertiary and higher education are over 20%. That's a pretty good return. Some of them would also generate net benefits if we measured things properly, such as investments in the environment. And those investments could sensibly be financed through borrowing, particularly in advanced economies, who are less credit constrained than developing ones. But some of this spending, like pensions and elements of healthcare, for example, will be recurrent and will need to be financed from tax revenues. And so the question is, where do you finance them? So in some countries, there is room to raise income and corporate taxes, since we've seen a decline in both of those over the last 30 years. In the UK, I think the obvious place to look is a better system of property tax through reform of council tax and business rates. Some people argue for a wealth tax, but of course 2/3 of global wealth is held in the form of property, and property is a lot easier to tax than wealth. And so I think it's a pretty good proxy. The other thing about property taxes is it helps address the intergenerational social contract and the inequities in property ownership between the old and the young. The other obvious place to look is to tax carbon, to accelerate the transition to a more sustainable economy. So much of the policy of the debate around what to do around, say, financial sector taking sustainability into account, or labeling of what's green and what's brown, most of those problems would disappear if we had a carbon tax, because then the price would tell you everything that you need to know. And of course, to avoid the adverse income distribution consequences of a carbon tax, the sort of gilets jaunes, yellow vest backlash, one can look at tax and dividend approaches that achieve changes in relative prices and compensate those on lower incomes. Now, it is tempting to invoke the Robin Hood solution of taxing the rich and giving money to the poor to fund a better social contract. But most countries find that in practice, measures that fundamentally change and equalize the distribution of opportunities in a society are far more powerful than anything the state can do through redistribution retroactively. So my approach of the book is to focus much more on these pre-distribution policies, such as equalizing access to good education or providing additional investments in deprived communities, because they're also more empowering to the individuals affected and reduce the risk of chronic dependency on state support. And if we're able to achieve fairer outcomes via the labor market by helping the poor into higher, better paid work, this has the advantage of reducing the need for benefit payments and the taxation that pays for it. If a society has to do a lot of redistribution, it means that its pre-distribution policies have failed. So let me conclude. A new social contract is not just about higher taxes and more redistribution and a bigger welfare state. It's about a fundamental reordering and equalizing of the distribution of opportunities and security in our society. The result of this would be higher productivity and the possibility of sharing risks more efficiently around childcare, health, work, and old age that are such a source of anxiety in today's societies. I think we owe each other more than our current social contracts deliver. We need to combine the invisible hand of the market with the visible hand of sympathy and a better social contract. Going back to Adam Smith, it's combining self-interest with sympathy. A new social contract, I think, is possible that gives everyone the possibility of a decent life, shares risks more humanely, and draws on everyone's talents. A better architecture of security and opportunity could be based on the three principles that I've outlined: minimum security for all, maximum investment in human capability and opportunity, and sharing risks more efficiently and equitably. And these principles provide the foundation for a society built on recognizing our interdependence, enabling everyone to fulfill their potential, and asking everyone to contribute as much as they can for the common good. I think this would marry the two halves of Adam Smith's intellectual legacy, the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations, in a way that I think he would have thoroughly approved of. Thank you very much.
That was excellent. Not simply because you tied it back to Smith, and because you emphasize what we are also trying to do here is not Smith, the singular libertarian, self-interested Smith, which if you read The Wealth of Nations in its entirety, you wouldn't even come to that conclusion, though many have. But you emphasize the theory of moral sentiments and his work in that regard in terms of sympathy. What I also like about your book, and we are selling copies downstairs for those that would like a copy for £10, which is a great deal. Thought I should do some promotion for it. Is what I also like about, if for those that know Smith, is that he's not prescriptive in many ways. He talks about principles, or you can infer many principles, but he's comparative and he's empirical. That's why so much of the social sciences that we know today were founded here during the Scottish Enlightenment. So yes, Oxford and Cambridge. I also went to Oxford too, so I feel some affinity to it. But the real innovation in higher education came during the Scottish Enlightenment, and it was because of the likes of Adam Smith and his comparative approach, looking at how different societies actually function. And I think that's what's important about your book, is that you don't identify any one particular policy. You must have, for example, a national health service. There's different models of social policy that allows for experimentation, allows for institutional and historical contingencies for each and every place that it happens. However, I have two questions, and I'll open it up to the floor. One is the retort that, particularly in the US, that the likes of Milton Friedman, and I know this because I've watched a video of him saying this, is that he would say in relation to the Nordics and the Nordic model, is that, well, these are very small, homogenous societies, and how do you do that in a place like the United States of America, which now has 350 million people? Geographically, it's immense. Now, Norway and Sweden, these are very large expanses, but they're still relatively, they're less homogenous than they were a generation or two ago, though they're also less generous than they were a generation or two ago. Yeah. So how then would you respond if Milton Friedman were sitting here and saying to you that the scale of it is impossible?
Yeah. So, do I need a mic, or can you hear me? You want me to use a mic? Yes. Okay, very good. So, it has often been argued that part of the reason you had the emergence of these strong social contracts in, say, the Nordic countries is because they are homogenous and people identify with each other. In Smith's law, the concentric circle was very clear, and so people were more likely to feel solidarity and want to support their fellow citizens. And in the United States, you have the curse of slavery. And there has always been an argument that the reason you never had a generous welfare state emerge in the United States was because white people didn't want to share with black people. And in ethnically diverse states, you have the lack of that fellow feeling that Smith talked about. I think it's actually less an issue of scale and more an issue of fostering a sense of fellow feeling and citizenship. One of the, just to give the US example, they used to teach civics in the US, and children were taught to...
I remember. Part of my high school curriculum, so yeah.
Was civics.
Yeah.
that is no longer the case in many parts of the country. And that feeling of what you owe society, and the fact that, for example, voting and paying your taxes is part of civic duty, and that society invests in you and your education and supports you when you stumble. And so I think it's more about fostering that culture than the challenge of scale, to try and build a social consensus around why this works. I think the other thing I try and do in the book is say, this is not welfarism. This is about investing in each other so that we are all better off. And that's the more pragmatic side of the story, but I think that is also part of the case one needs to make.
So I have more questions, but given the time, I'd like to open it to the floor, and I have some questions from online. So if anybody in the audience would like, Ian, please. Can you speak loud? Is there a mic that will go around so that those listening online can?
So first of all, if books a tenner, I will buy a copy, I think, because it's a great talk. Can I ask two questions? One question, like when you're talking, I was thinking, how does your social contract relate to the ideas of social capital? Is this kind of a way to bring back social capital? And the second, just at the end of your talk, are you kind of advocating for like a Georgian land tax, like Henry George, the last of the classical economists who gets forgotten about these days?
Interesting. So, I mean, you're right. There is clearly, in some ways, you could substitute what I call the social contract with the idea of social capital, which is about the ties that bind society. So yes, it is connected to that tradition. I mean, the social capital, the term social capital has people have tried to measure it in lots of different ways, and I probably have a more expansive definition than, say, people like Putnam and others at Harvard who've written quite a lot about social capital. But because I include norms and values and policies and laws, so it is more expansive. But it's definitely thematically similar. And on land tax, I mean, look, land taxes are very. I would do land or property taxes. I think there are huge attractions to that. So yes, I would support that for many reasons. First, it's easy to find and tax. You can't hide your land in a Panama Papers account in Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. The argument about land taxes has always been valuation is problematic. If you search online on Zoopla, you can pretty much find a pretty proximate value to any piece of property. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's, I think the valuation issue is definitely over argued. And part of the income inequality, income inequality is a complicated question, but let's just say, let's take the UK data. Income inequality hasn't changed that much in the UK over the last couple of decades. What's massively changed is wealth inequality, and that's largely driven by what's happening to the housing market. And the only way you can begin to address that is through some kind of taxation of wealth. And I would argue, if you go back to the intergenerational social contract, someone's going to have to pay to take care of all those old people. And so the younger generation today they've got to be so productive. And so old people have a huge interest in investing in the education and skills of today's younger generation, because when I showed you that hump, it's that hump. They're going to pay that hump. In their middle age, they're the ones who are going to have to pay those taxes. And so I think one has to also talk about this. I know the politics of this is very, very difficult, but one has to talk about it in this intergenerational sense to persuade the elderly who have lots of housing wealth to accept that they have to, in order to sustain society, contribute to investing in the next generation.
Take another question from the audience, if there are any. Yes, please.
Thanks.
Hi, this may be a follow-up to the Milton Friedman hypothetical question, but could you say more about how the United States fits into your picture? Because you've talked about slavery and that being a reason why there might not be the social contract you advocate. But the United States seems to be very successful in spite of not having the policies you advocate. And is there evidence on differences in degree of innovation between the US and, say, Denmark that you would emulate?
Yeah, so the United States is very successful in terms of per capita incomes and economic growth. It doesn't do so well on measures like life expectancy. Has the lowest life expectancy among advanced economies. Doesn't do so well on inequality. Doesn't do so well on other measures of health and well-being. So it's a different model. It's a very kind of high-powered incentives model, with very high-powered incentives for innovation, and hence they tend to do much better on things like patenting and technology innovation. And I think, every society is different, and societies will, so much will depend on the history of a country and the nature of the social contract that history generates. So, as Adam said in the book, I don't think having a national health service is the only answer to a country's health problems. European countries tend to have insurance-based systems where employers pay and contribute to an insurance model, and they generate pretty good health outcomes, actually. Not dissimilar to, slightly sometimes better than the UK. And so I'm agnostic about whether you have an employer insurance-based healthcare system or a national healthcare system. I'm kind of just interested in whether it delivers good outcomes for citizens. The US, in sharp contrast, has spent 17% of GDP on health with pretty awful outcomes. So I would say, well, that, for me, that social contract is not so great. There are other aspects in the US that would work better in terms of, and also, the US is a very big place, and so what happens at different state levels is also very, very different. And so there are many social contracts in the United States. Education systems are hugely variable across states. And so I think that's also a very interesting aspect of the US, is that you have many social contracts and states learn from each other. And there's a source of innovation and learning and creativity that comes from that.
So I'm going to read a question from one of the online audience, specifically from Rita Passi, who's on the Harriet-Watt Finance Committee. She works at the World Bank. And she asks, drawing on your background in education and development, if we could design a universal curriculum for youth, what skills sets or knowledge would be a priority? Should we change something in the curricula we have today? What are your thoughts about employer responsibility for continuing education or sharing the cost between the state and enterprises and organizations?
Yeah. So I'm not sure that we could create a universal curriculum, because I think an educational curriculum it's actually quite political in terms of what you want the next generation to learn. And so I think that has to be very specific to a community. Having said that, though, I do think there are certain skills that will become far more important in the future than say, how I was taught.
Those civics would be good.
Civics would be good. I think I would definitely argue for civics. But what I wouldn't argue for is, say, some of the rote memorization that some of us were subjected to in our own schooling. That is pretty pointless when kids have smartphones and they can just look it up. And so I do think that curricula going forward does have to be much more about how do we teach this generation to use these tools that they have available. And I'm sure someone's going to ask me about ChatGPT and how that's going to affect universities going forward. But we're having to figure this out. I mean, we will now. We're preparing young people to go into a world in which those tools are going to be in the workplaces that they enter. And so they need to be familiar with them in an educational context. Banning them is foolish. And so less memorization, more on how do you, if you use one of these tools, how do you know it's true or not? How do you navigate reliable sources versus non-reliable sources? How do you make judgments about the opinions that you read online, and how do you filter through those? I think it's those skills that a modern education needs to focus on. And in many ways, the best education has always been about those kind of critical thinking skills. I was reading something this morning which said, a good education is, expands the mind's capacity rather than filling it up with things. And that couldn't be more true given what's happening with technological innovations today.
So I'd like to take one more question from the audience, if there is one.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, what gives you cause for optimism for the vision that you've outlined?
Yeah, I wrote the book from a place of pessimism, to be honest, because I spent 30 years of my career working in international development and international economics, and over my own life, I have personally witnessed a massive improvement in human welfare. The largest reduction in poverty humanity has ever seen, the biggest gains in life expectancy. And I kept, and I objectively could see these improvements. And yet across the world, I kept seeing more and more countries subjected to massive political polarization and huge levels of dissatisfaction in people's lives. And I couldn't understand how that could be. And so it was that place of pessimism, it was 2016 when I was, presented with this puzzle, when so much was going wrong in the world and I couldn't understand where it was coming from. So it came from a place of pessimism. I think, so it came. It was also, surely there must be an answer here. And so increasingly I came to the view that it was because the social contract hadn't kept up with our economies, that in some sense the theory of moral sentiments hadn't kept up with the wealth of nations, and we'd lost the interconnection between those two that was driving this problem. But I guess your question is, why are you optimistic that people will implement these changes? I think in my experience as a policymaker, I know the sad reality that people tend to make big changes only at times of crisis. We've got lots of those. And I think what tends to happen when a crisis hits is that whatever policies and ideas are lying around, people grab them. And so my thinking was, let me throw some ideas out there so that they're lying around. And so when a country is facing a crisis in thinking about healthcare financing or labor law and benefits, that these ideas are out there. And I think that's all we can do in terms of creating the possibility and the space that someone will pick them up and give us a good reason to be optimistic.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I just have a comment really based on your last remarks, because you worked in Whitehall and you talked about policy responses in a crisis, but to me one of the problems is politics, especially at the moment. We could write an essay on that, but it's a lack of long-term planning and thinking. It's good to hear that policies like the lifelong learning entitlement could have long-term impacts, but you talk about the first 1,000 days. Yeah. We're not seeing a lot going on in there, and some of these just aren't vote winners to the common garden person in the street, and I think that's one of the problems. But it's interesting to hear your remarks on that based on your guys.
So in short, how do we implement this? Yeah. Right?
You are right, and politics has gotten worse because of the 24/7 media cycle, and it's gotten more short-term, not less short-term. And that is a huge problem. I'll just throw out a few ideas. I observe if you look around the world at which countries tend to have better social contracts than others, countries that have proportional representation systems tend to do better than winner-takes-all systems. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because if you have proportional representation, you have to make more compromises because you have to take care of more people. Whereas winner-takes-all systems tend to be more absolute. So that's one observation. So if you can change your voting system, that helps. The second observation I'd make is that in some areas, societies have carved out certain decisions outside of the political process, because in some ways they're too important to leave to politicians. Now this is very undemocratic, and I acknowledge that. But if you think about how we set interest rates in the economy now, we have independent central banks who have a political mandate, but you don't let politicians, massively reduce interest rates before elections to create mini booms so that they can get themselves reelected. In the healthcare system, many countries, I think now, I want to say more than 50 countries now have something called, in the literature they call them health technology agencies. In the UK it's called NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. We don't let politicians decide what the NHS will pay for. We get doctors and accountants and lawyers to sit down and figure out which treatments actually provide value for money. And the doctors say, yes, this treatment is medically valid, and the accountants and the economists sit down and calculate the cost-benefit ratios and say, yes, we can afford this. And the few times in history when we've let politicians meddle with that, say when David Cameron was lobbied by certain groups who were interested in the treatment of certain kinds of cancers, and they set aside money to treat them, it was a disaster, and they ended up spending the money in very inefficient ways. So there's certain things that we've carved out. You can't do that for everything because it's undemocratic. But I do think, for me, for example, early years education is one of those things that I would love to carve that out, because it's such a long-term investment. You don't get the benefits of early years for 20, 30, 40 years. And yet the evidence is so compelling. So I do think we need a debate about some things that as a society you think this is just too important to let the political cycle determine how we do it. And then finally, we do have to think about the way politics operates. In some countries, the issues are really around money. In the US, for example, there's just too much money in politics. The Supreme Court made a ruling that corporations are citizens and that political donations are protected as free speech. And that has resulted in, this huge amount of corporate lobbying, of political decision making, and that's a problem. In the UK, it's less extreme than in the US, but there is huge amounts of gerrymandering, the ways constituencies are drawn up. The current bee in my bonnet at the moment is under these new voting rules where you have to show a photo ID. An over 60 Oyster card is legitimate photo ID, but an 18-year-old's Oyster card is not legitimate ID. Now, what does that tell you, right? Let's rig the voting so that the elderly have an easier time of voting than the young. Anyway, so, let's tilt the intergenerational social contract in favor of, So I do think we have to think really critically about the way our democracies work and ask ourselves, is this what we want? Are we creating is this truly democratic? And, I was reading a political scientist who was arguing that every society has a tendency toward authoritarianism. And at every point, you have to be fighting for democracy to make sure that what's happening in society isn't pushing you in that direction. And we have probably taken our democracies for granted for too long. And I think we do need to think hard about how do we restore that truly democratic and more long-term thinking in our political process.
Well, on that positive note, I would say we have something to fight for. I'd like to thank you all for being here, for those that are listening online, for what has been an excellent Adam Smith lecture in the spirit of Adam Smith, that will take our thinking here at Panmure House into the future for many years to come. This is definitely a debate that we're going to continue with, and it's great thanks that you're here. And so if we can give her Baroness Minouche Shafik a round of applause before she leaves us for the United States.